Ready to explore the cutting edge of digital infrastructure? I'm Carrie Charles, your host of Let's Get Digital. Join me as we dive into the ideas, technologies, and leaders transforming the way we connect. From wireless telecom to fiber networks, data centers, and beyond. Sponsored by Broadstaff in partnership with RCR Wireless News. Now, let's dive in and let's get digital. Thank you for joining me today again on Let's Get Digital. I am glad you're here. We have an exciting episode for you today. Someone I respect immensely and I've known for many years. It is Raul Martynek. He is the CEO of DataBank, a very fast-growing data center and cloud infrastructure company, helping power the digital economy and the rapid rise of AI. Raul, thank you for being here again.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So, Raul, I had you on the show. This was years ago. So I really wanted you to come back on. There's been a lot happening in your space and just talk about it a bit, give us some ideas of the future and, let us see into your crystal ball a bit. But first, we want to hear about you. So please tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to your seat.
Sure. Well, I won't go too long because I've been in the space a long time, so it is a long story. But no, I've been fortunate to be in kind of digital infrastructure for the last 30 years. Got in at the advent of the commercial internet, in the mid 90s. At the time, obviously, the internet was just emerging. Data centers were not a thing. And it was about telecom, right? So like a lot of folks that started back then, I started in telecom and it was an entrepreneurial business. It was what was called a CLEC. It was in the Northeast and, it was the dot-com era. So we were able to, grow the business and raise institutional capital in 1999. That was my first kind of experience with institutional capital. So since then, I've been fortunate enough to go from telecom to fiber, to cloud, and then over the last 15 years or so into data centers, always working with sponsors, building businesses in the space. And then, got the DataBank, which is obviously where I'm currently at, about 10 years ago at this point, which is kind of crazy. I knew Mark Anzi from Digital Bridge. And at the time, Digital Bridge was an emerging platform. They were looking to invest in data center businesses. And given my experience there, Mark asked me to join, which I did. And we ended up acquiring DataBank in 2016 when it was, 6 data centers in 3 markets. So, over the last, almost 10 years, we've been able to grow it to, be one of the largest data center businesses in the U.S. So it's been, an incredible journey.
So tell me more about DataBank.
Yeah, so look, we're a data center operator and developer, focused here in the U.S. Today we have the largest geographic footprint of data centers in the U.S. In other words, we're in more markets than anyone else. So a very, important factor from my perspective because, when customers make a decision around, where to put their IT assets, where to co-locate, geography typically is one of the top criteria, right? So the way I look at it is, we're in more geographies, which basically means we have more opportunities to solve customer needs. And, that's been a big part of our success, having this very large geographic reach coupled with, the ability to invest in meaningful size data centers, which we have been over the last couple of years.
So the data center space has changed a lot over the last 5 years even. So
Sure.
Tell me what has changed in your view, and also how have you navigated some of these challenges?
Yeah, it's really interesting just looking at how it's changed just, while I've been here at DataBank. So when I got here in 2016, the data center space, it was obviously very well established. In fact, at the time, there was, 5 public companies. But when you actually look at like the size of those companies, they were all relatively small, right? Equinix was like a $2 billion a year business, Switch and CoreSite and CyrusOnes were, $300 to $500 million a year businesses, right? And DataBank was a $50 million business, right? So again, the sector overall was relatively small. And back then, ultimately, customers, obviously same product, right? Same, form factor, a data center, but, their needs were just incredibly smaller, right? I remember when we did our underwriting for DFW3, which was, going to be our largest data center at the time in 2016. It was going to be a 10 megawatt data center, and people were like hand wringing over like, are we going to be able to sell that capacity? And at the time, if you could get a 1 megawatt or a 2 megawatt deal, it was considered, just massive, and everyone was super excited, right? And really, that's been the big change. You fast forward to today, and the requirements have just gotten enormous. 10x, 20x, 100x of what back in 2016. So that's, I think, been the biggest change in the sector, is just kind of the scale of it has gotten just increasingly larger. Obviously, that was happening through 2015, 16 through, call it, pre-AI. You still had these increasing requirements, and then AI showed up in 2023, and that's kind of step functioned it higher in terms of the size requirements, right? Enterprise deals in 2015, like I said, were 1 or 2 megawatts. Hyperscale deals back then, if it was a big one, might be 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts. You fast forward to today, and we have enterprise deals that are 20 or 30 megawatts, and then you got hyperscale deals that are 250 megawatts to a gigawatt, right? So that's kind of really been the evolution of the space, and obviously why it's become front and center in terms of people's minds.
Has it been challenging for you to adapt to all of this insane growth and these changes?
Yeah, listen, anytime you grow a business, from where we started to now, there's always going to be, scaling challenges, right? Look, it has been 9 years too. So, it's been somewhat of a, not, gradual, but, rapid type of growth. I think, two things on that. The hardest things are, obviously attracting, good talent into the organization, because people are the foundation of your business. And as you need to, get more and more people, that becomes harder and harder, especially to maintain the quality of that. Number two, just execution and kind of customer experience becomes harder as you scale out these businesses. You have a lot more, layers of management in a business. So, the execs are less connected to what's happening on the ground, and you have to figure out a way to, make sure to ensure that you don't lose that connectivity with the customer experience. And then the third and, really challenging piece is capital, right? I mean, we bought the business in 2016, we bought the entire business for $320 million at the time, which was considered, a good size transaction. Now we're building data centers that a single data center is, 500 million of capital, right? So that's kind of, the capital aspect has become, one of the real determinants to, how quickly you can grow, is the ability to access capital, and the ability to access capital on favorable terms.
So obviously there's a lot of hype right now for AI, for data centers. I mean, I can't even read anything or the Wall Street Journal every day without hearing something about it. So is this demand real? Is it durable? I mean, what could derail it?
That's a great question. So I'll start with your last part of that question. Is it durable? It absolutely 100% is durable, right? My strong view is, the way I describe data centers is, what is their actual function? Their function is to facilitate technology adoption for, humans, right? For businesses and people, right? If you think about everything on your phone, everything on your computer, it originates and terminates in a data center, right? So what we've obviously seen over the last 30 years is this, insatiable demand to consume technology, which means that, that you need more data centers. So my strong view is, 10 years from now, we're going to need more data centers, because humans are going to find more and more ways to consume technology, adopt technology, for all the reasons that we know about. It's for business, for entertainment, for education, for communication, for applications, all that. So there's that kind of macro demand trend. And then when you kind of peel down or peel back, that onion, there's a lot of different currents in there, right? So the way I look at the market right now is, And we're in a position where DataBank, we have this large footprint. We have 2,500 customers. So we get to see a lot. We have a wide range and a wide aperture of kind of visibility into customers' consumption of technology. And we look at our business and, it's got a big enterprise segment, right? Those are all, Fortune 1000 type companies down to mid-sized companies that obviously are 100% dependent on their data, their applications. And that segment of the market we think is really healthy. We're seeing enterprises invest in technology adoption, invest in digital transformation, invest in hybrid architectures. That's all driving enterprise demand. The hyperscalers, obviously they're, everyone knows about them now. Everyone knows about their growth. For folks that haven't been following it, they just all came out and reaffirmed or affirmed what their CapEx commitments are going to be for 2026. And it's staggering, right? You take the top 5-6 hyperscalers and their capital commitments, for 2026 are like $625 billion, up from like $400 billion, $450 billion in 2025. So there's no doubt that cohort is going to invest. And then you have the kind of AI companies, right? The OpenAIs, the Anthropics, the Perplexities, the Cursors. And, Silicon Valley, I saw one stat where Silicon Valley has invested $200 billion in AI startups. So all these companies that are trying to bring, LLM-based products to market, well, guess what? They're all consuming tokens, consuming GPUs. And that's the part of the market that I think it's nascent, right? Because it really started, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. And those business models are still not 100% proven in terms of their ability to, become profitable. So that's kind of the part of the market that I think when you read these articles about, AI fears and AI bubbles, it's that segment of the market that people are focused on. The hyperscalers have real businesses, right? These enterprises obviously have real businesses. And now you have this kind of new entrants, that are trying to form businesses. And obviously there's a huge expectation that there are going to be winners there. But certainly when you look at past trends, not everyone's a winner, right? And ultimately there's going to be a bunch of, creative destruction that happens. But I think, again, for long-term players who are not looking to capitalize on a short-term, euphoria, I think it's a really good market to be in and a great market to be in over the long term.
So it sounds like, the capital is there and willing and able and ready, but what are some of the bottlenecks that could prevent these data centers from being built?
Yeah, so there's more and more bottlenecks occurring every day. So, the capital's there, but guess what? There isn't unlimited capital. And you're already starting to see that. Oracle had some issues in terms of, being able to, continue to lease capacity in the marketplace. And they obviously, it was 2 weeks ago, I think, that they came out with a $50 billion debt and equity, raise that they're going to enact over the next, year or so. So you're starting to see even, at the scale that we're talking about, the financial system, can't digest all that capital. So I do think access to capital is going to be a constraint for people, that I think that, as we continue to, we forward, that it will become more and more scrutinized over what investments get made. So I think that's going to be one. Obviously, we still are in a situation where power is a regulator of capacity. There's a lot of capacity that is being leased. Last year, the estimates are it was a record year that there was, call it 14 gigawatts of data center capacity that was leased in 2025. I will guarantee you that all 14 gigawatts of that, they had a very clear pathway to power. You wouldn't be leasing data center capacity either as a developer or as a customer if you weren't 100% convinced that there was a pathway to power there, right? So yes, there's a bottleneck around power, but obviously the evidence shows that the industry is figuring that out, but that's continue to be somewhat of a regulator. And then the third one is, rising costs and lead times, right? Obviously with all this demand, the cost to build data centers is going up. So that's putting more pressure on people in terms of, is it justified? And then, as a function of that, what we're seeing is an increasing amount of community opposition to data centers, right? I'm sitting today in New York, and New York recently, there's a bill that got introduced at the state Senate level that would put a 3-year moratorium on data centers as they understand their full impact to electrical prices and to environmental issues. And what I think that's misguided, but it's an example of kind of the reaction that is happening from the population in terms of pushback on new data center developments. And this is happening in red states and in blue states, right? This is not, limited to a particular area. You got some significant pushback in Northern Virginia with a number of projects that have been kind of, derailed, and Chicago, so it's going to become increasingly harder to build because of the capital, because of the supply chain, because of community pushback, and because of power. But that's, in our view, that's a bad thing, but also a good thing, right? Because ultimately, our sector is in a healthy state from, certainly from our perspective, because there's a good supply-demand balance. One thing that we know about, any type of infrastructure sector is it's supply and demand that ultimately dictates, how good it is for the people that are in it. And right now, it's a good time to be a data center developer because, you have more demand than supply and you have these constraints.
How are you preparing for these challenges?
If
there is such a thing.
Yeah, no. There's no magic bullet. It is purely grinding it out, right? In all three of these, it means that you need to spend more time on raising capital. You need to spend more time on your supply chain. You need to spend more time and energy and money on community relations and in public relations and things like that. And you got to spend more time on, securing power and making sure that you have a very multi-year type of kind of scope, right? I mean, 7-8 years ago, you would think about building a data center, and because it was, a 10 megawatt or 7 megawatt or 12 megawatt data center, you kind of decided, okay, in January, let's go do that. And then you would find a piece of land by March or April. And of course, the power was going to be there because there was plenty of power at that level. And then, 18 months later, you had a data center. Right now, it's right now, we're buying land right now where we think the timeline to power is 2029, 2030.
Wow.
But that's the way you have to think, right? So that's the way ourselves and other people in the sector are responding. We're just taking a very long-term view on things. And that's a function of all those kind of, the slowdown that happens through all those constraints that we just talked about.
So across the US and also globally, where do you see capacity scaling the fastest over the next decade? And what differentiates markets that win versus, again, what we talked about, some that stall?
Yeah, well, listen, on a global basis, the U.S. is well positioned to continue its leadership role. I think 60%, I think is the number I've seen of all the data center infrastructure in the world is in the U.S. And, the U.S. is going to continue to do well, right? Because, ultimately, while everyone's complaining about all these issues, there are things that are being done to create new generation, to create new distribution, to increase supply chains, to allow for this development to continue. So I think we're extremely well positioned on a global basis. Within the U.S., right now, there's a couple locations that are better positioned than others. And that is really a function of power availability and the ability to get new power onto the grid. I'm based in Dallas, and Texas, in my view, is in a great position to emerge, if it keeps going, to be the number one data center market in the country and surpass, Ashburn. And that's because, Texas has a very can-do attitude. It also has a unique power situation where the Texas has its own grid. It's called the ERCOT grid. And it's been streamlined over the last, decade or more to, facilitate people connecting to the grid and to facilitate distribution to endpoints. And investments are being made there by ERCOT and the utilities to do that. So I suspect, a market like Texas is going to do well. What you're also seeing as a function of all this demand is locations that, heretofore were not data center locations are becoming data center locations. You're seeing people build data centers in North Dakota, in Wyoming, in, Louisiana. Some of that is being done by the hyperscalers who traditionally have done that in the past, where they have such big needs that satisfy themselves. They can say, okay, you know what? It's okay if we're in, rural North Carolina and build a data center cluster that works for us. People like ourselves, given our broad range of customers, my enterprise customers, they don't want to go to North Dakota. So we're not going to go there, right? We're going to stay in metro markets. But the AI companies, especially the new ones and the GPU as a service companies, they're willing to go to those locations to satisfy, their near term demand needs. So I think it's going to be a combination of, some existing markets, some new markets that will kind of, emerge over the next, 5 to 10 years. And, ultimately, no one really knows how much of this infrastructure you need. I think that's a big question. We'll find out. If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Very true. So DataBank has got such an exciting growth story. Looking back, Raul, what decisions do you feel have made the biggest difference? It could be one decision, it could be two, in that growth. And also, it's interesting, you did decide to stay private versus pursuing an IPO.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind on that. So we've been in a fortunate position where, kind of to your topic there around an IPO or liquidity or an exit, is that DataBank, when it was originally stood up, it was stood up as a separate SPV, right? So we are not in any fund, which in funds, the way they work is people raise money, put it into a fund, they make investments, and then there's an end of life where the fund needs to liquidate those investments. So we've been fortunate in that we have an open-ended kind of platform where we can continue to bring in capital to grow the business and to rotate investors so that we can keep going. And that's been, that decision, which kind of was purposeful and also kind of situational when it happened back in 2016. Looking back at it, was pivotal for our ability to continue to grow as an independent platform. So that would be one. Another one would be, we were fortunate to align ourselves with, some great investors, right? DigitalBridge, of course, as our lead investor. But, over the years, we've been able to bring in folks like Swiss Life, which is, one of the largest insurance companies in Europe, who've been able to support us. In 2024, we raised $2 billion of new equity with Australian Super, which is a pension system out of Australia that has, a very long-term horizon and deep pockets. So that kind of access to capital, given the scale of what we talked about, was critical. And then number three, and really underpins everything is, the people that are in the business, right? I've been fortunate to attract a great leadership team, the folks that, I work with on a daily basis. And then we've been able to attract, just a tremendous number of other really great people so that, the business can continue to execute, right? One of the stats that we like to tout is that, DataBank has had 44 quarters of consecutive positive net bookings. So that means, for over 10 years, we've consistently grown the business in and out of any type of market silo or any type of market disruption. And really, we think that is kind of a testament to the quote unquote machine that we've built that can execute regardless of market conditions. And, knock on wood, we'll continue to do that.
And I know how important the people aspect is to you, Raul. And let's talk about talent for a minute. Where are you seeing the workforce shortages? Are you seeing any specific skill sets in the data center world that are short now and will get worse coming up?
Yes, I think, talent, we spend a lot of time on that in two ways. Number one, attracting talent, but more importantly, keeping talent, right? So we really work hard to ensure that, we have a great company culture. We just got a nomination for one of, great places to work. That was, very highly scored in terms of the responses from the employees. In June of last year, we rolled out a company-wide equity program so that every data banker that works at the company has an ability to get a financial stake in the business. So, we're all owners in the business. So those are the types of things that we do to try to, keep people with us that are, great people. And then on the new hire front, look, you're building a lot of data centers, and that's the part that's really accelerating. So people that are in the construction field, in the project management field, and then people that are in the facilities management. After you build a data center, you have to maintain it. all those kind of folks are in demand across the country. So those are areas that, we have to really spend a lot of time on and make sure that, they know who DataBank is and that, we're able to convince them to come join us.
So you talked about DataBank University when we last spoke. And I think obviously what we all need to do is we have to build our own talent. And that is crucial to be able to, to carry out these visions that we have. So talk a little bit more about DataBank University. What prompted it? How did you create it? And what does it do?
Yeah, so listen, DataBank University is really kind of our online training platform to allow people to advance professionally within the company, right? And that, being able to progress your workforce, give them new professional development opportunities, an ability to grow financially, to grow from a managerial perspective is critical to retaining people that are ambitious and good and, A players, as we say. So the university is kind of the training platform, and it really spans all kinds of disciplines within DataBank, right? So what we look at is, different parts of our organization and how do we create a career path for people in that organization. One of our largest components of folks is data center operations, right? We have a lot of people that are inside these data centers carrying and feeding for the data centers and for our customers' needs. So we have a structured program there where, you come in, relatively inexperienced as a DCT1, you can go up to DCT3 and then a lead. And then from there, you can go into managerial positions. So we want to make sure that that university underpins their ability to gain new skills and to be able to grow along that way. We do that on the sales side. We have, over 100 folks on the sales side. And we've been able to, now bring in, more kind of greener type of talent that we think has the right DNA and be able to bring them into positions like, a BDR position, which is a business development rep, where they're kind of more, cold calling or responding to inbound leads. And then from there, get them to an account management position. And then from there to kind of more of a national account manager. So, and we're seeing some good progression there. So it's really about, trying to create these career progressions within your functional groups in the organization. And then the university is kind of the knowledge that you need to have as you scale up into these more higher positions of responsibility.
What is the DataBank way?
So the DataBank way is kind of, our cultural cornerstones, our leadership behaviors, right? We have got, years ago, it was actually like in 2018 or 19, we really felt like the business was not hitting on all cylinders, that we had kind of, as I like to say, different tribes within the company. By definition, we're a business that is decentralized. We have 1,000 associates, but they're in 65 different markets. And then there's people that are remote. How do you get such a diverse geographic group that isn't interacting with each other, on a day-to-day basis? How do you get them to operate as a single team? And the DataBank way is really kind of our cultural, mantras that, we instituted in the business and that everyone understands, right? And, to give you an example, like leadership behaviors, it's, that's kind of like, hey, how are we going to agree to interact with each other, right? And with our customers, right? So for example, one of our leadership behaviors is take extreme ownership, right? It's like if you see something, we don't want to hear it's not my job. We want to hear we have a problem here and we need to fix it, and let's coalesce as a group and fix it, right? We have another one that's called collaborate before you escalate, right? We felt that, back then we were at too much, people were peers and they had an issue to resolve, but they weren't really trying to resolve it. They were just escalating it to their manager and then trying to get their managers to resolve it. That doesn't work as you scale. We want to push decision-making down as much as possible. So we ended up coming up with that. So it's really a way, it's kind of our own internally developed, thought process around, how we're going to operate as a group, and then how are we going to engage with our customers and our partners so that we can, drive a great business.
So last question. If the data center industry gets one big decision wrong in the next decade, what do you think it will be? And what should leaders do now to stay resilient, come out stronger, regardless of how this growth cycle plays out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, if you look at the data center market and you look at kind of some of the ebbs and flows of the data center market, it goes back to, what I said earlier, which is this is fundamentally a business about supply and demand, right? So back to the earlier comments, there's no doubt in my mind that demand for data centers is going to be greater. There's going to be more data centers 10 years from now, 15 years from now. But, look, in every business cycle, there's, it's not a straight line. And ultimately, where I think the sector could get into trouble is if we end up in a scenario where, for whatever, on some type of short-term or medium-term basis, we end up with a lot more supply than there is demand, because it's real estate. It's no different than, when you buy a residential house or you're looking for commercial office space, when vacancy is low, it's a seller's market. And when vacancy is high, it's a buyer's market, right? So, and we had periods where there was a lot of vacancy in certain markets, and it was a slower dynamic. I mean, it's hard to see that right now because of, kind of the craziness that's going on. But, to expect this to continue forever is also, I think, crazy, right? So there's going to be some type of correction, pullback, slowdown, hard to say when. And ultimately, from my perspective, that's where you got to make good decisions around where you're going to develop, because it is a real estate business, like I said, and it's location, location, location. So that's kind of the way we think about it. Other people have different views, and hey, it's a free market. People can have different views. And then from a leadership perspective, it's, feeling that, these businesses are going to get a lot bigger, right? And that, ultimately, everyone's going to, we're going to be, we're now, north of $1 billion in revenue, and, we're going to be multi-billion in revenue in 5 years or 10 years, right? So making sure that, we can still scale the business, still maintain that intimacy that we want to have with our customers, still have a great working environment. That's going to be the challenge over the next 5 to 10 years.
Raul, I always enjoy talking to you. I always learn a lot, and I truly appreciate you coming on the show. This has been fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Carrie. It's great to be here.
I'll see you soon.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Let's Get Digital. This podcast is powered by Broadstaff, a national staffing firm specializing in digital infrastructure talent. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and join me next time as we explore more stories at the intersection of technology, talent, and transformation. Until then, let's get digital.